Within the walls of this hospital lies an unsettling secret. Join us as we delve into the entanglement between a female doctor and her ghostly lover, and her struggle against unknown forces. Don't miss this story filled with mystery and supernatural phenomena. Chapter 20. Dance with the Devil. On the dark rooftop of the helipad, the rain had stopped. Clouds parted as if by an unseen hand. Grace shivered, the thin cotton scrubs she wore no match against the March Pittsburgh night. Today was the first day of spring, but winter didn't seem willing to surrender. Do you remember? Jimmy repeated. That night. Our first night. She remembered. It was the only time in her life she had believed in magic, in the unknown, in hope. On that ancient hilltop, surrounded by sacred stones that sang, caressed by his strong arms, she had dared to believe. There was a meteor shower, she said. 1,000 falling stars. I felt dizzy, like I was falling with them. I didn't know which way was up. She craned her head to look at him, reached a finger to trace his strong jawline. A shiver swept through her. To be able to touch him again, after all this time. The illusion was marred only by the sight of the tower shimmering through his transparent form. Why couldn't her imagination fix that? I remember falling and you catching me, she finished. Then look, Grace. He turned her so that she was snugged against his chest, his arms wrapped around her, both facing west. The sun was now hidden by the tower, but reflections of its golden glow could be spied in the clouds above. Then the wind scudded the few last wisps of clouds aside, revealing an indigo twilight sky. Watch, Grace. Do you see them? She did. Falling stars, shooting through the night above the Pittsburgh skyline. Yes, she whispered. Make a wish, Grace. Wish hard, for what's most important. Wish carefully. Wish for what you want most in the world. She understood now why her diseased mind had brought her here. Hadn't she imagined this rooftop as her last resort when she found herself trapped in this hell on earth? Grace squeezed her eyes shut. Jimmy's arms tightened around her chest. This should be easy. She'd been wishing for the same thing ever since she woke during the brain biopsy. To go home and die, to be with Jimmy again, to finally leave this world that no longer held any light, or joy or magic. But now as she tried to form the thought, she saw Alex and Kat. Their laughter rang through her mind. She thought of what they'd suffered in their short lives, what they still faced. She wished that they could experience the love and joy she'd been blessed with, that they would find the strength and courage to face what was to come, that they wouldn't have to face their future alone. You wished well, Jimmy said, his breath caressing the side of her neck, feeling warmer than any ghost should. Open your eyes. She did. Overhead, the meteors continued their dance across the sky, shimmering faintly against the city lights. Just like that first night, she whispered into the darkness. 1,001 stars. I wished on every blessed one, Jimmy said. Do you know what I wished for back then? No. She lied. She had a very good idea what he wished for, it haunted her to this day. Don't tell me, don't say it, she begged. She squeezed her eyes shut against the tears that threatened to spill out. He turned her within his embrace, tilted her chin up, smoothed away her tears with a calloused fingertip. I wish to spend the rest of my life with you, Grace. His lips caressed her forehead. Grace kept her eyes shut tight, suddenly terrified of what she might see if she opened them. Open your eyes, Grace, he commanded. Open them. Curiosity trumped her misgivings. She opened her eyes. Jimmy stood before her, reaching to take her hands in his. As he raised her left hand to his lips, the faint glow of gold from her rings was swallowed by his shadow. He stood before her, his body whole, undamaged, solid. He threw his head back, his laughter splitting the air. Then he snagged her by the waist and raised her up high, spinning her around the abandoned rooftop. You did it, love. You did it. Jimmy felt like howling at the moon. So he did. A triumphant, gleeful howl that exploded into the air. The howl of a beast, a creature of the night, a being of sheer power. Except he was none of those and all of them. Rain cascaded down on him, chilling his naked flesh. The goosebumps rising on his bare skin made him laugh, a brittle noise that sounded hollow to his ears. His ears. He could hear himself. He sucked in a deep breath and tried once more. This time the sound was a bit closer to how he remembered laughter, but still tinny, like the soundtrack from a B horror flick. Grace must have felt the same, because she was clawing at him, trying to push free of his embrace. As if he'd ever let her go. Not now, after coming so very far to hold her again. The cold night air was intoxicating, as was the scent of the woman in his arms. He whipped her around once more, spinning so hard and fast that he began to feel dizzy. Dizzy, he'd totally forgotten what it felt like to have your head rushing past your body like that. Jimmy, please. Grace's voice finally broke through his exultation. He stopped, swayed a moment and steadied himself, still holding her tight. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear. He sniffed and realized he could smell her fear as well, washing off her in waves, caressing his nostrils with a primitive surge of power. Grace was afraid. Of him. The thought should have brought him to his senses, but instead her fear was as overwhelming as the knowledge that he was alive once more. Power, far greater than he'd ever held in his previous life, surged through him. Accompanying it was desire, lust, primal passion. The knowledge that the woman in his arms was his and his alone. He crushed her mouth beneath his, barely noticing her fists glancing off his bare chest and back. He tasted her, feasted on her, inhaled her, embraced her and knew her. Their eyes met and slowly, so slowly, she relaxed in his grasp. The fear fled from her eyes, replaced by wonder and awe. Her body trembled against his and a small noise of amazement caught in her throat as she relinquished herself to him. Cradling her in his arms, he strode through puddles and carried her out of the night chill and back into the annex. Ah, the tender joy of caring for another. How well he remembered that. His bare feet slapped against the cold linoleum, sending shivers of delight up his spine. Every molecule of air that brushed against him, every mote of dust disturbed by his passing, every small exhalation of her breath on his skin, shimmered over and into him so that each sensation became precious and vital. Say my name again, he commanded as he pushed through the door leading to the abandoned call rooms. She met his gaze head-on, no fear in her eyes now. Jimmy. Or, love, his voice emerged a ragged whisper, as he skimmed his lips over her face, memorizing every inch, every nuance. My Grace. I missed you so. Jimmy couldn't stop the tears streaming down his face, slipping onto her cheek as she clung to him, shaking. Together they stood, broken, bowed, and united. The only sound Jimmy could hear in the empty, deserted hallway was the thump of her heart, as it pulsed against his flesh. This was what he had returned for. Our gra buana brach. Our love lives forever. Alex couldn't remember a time when he was happier. Tonight was better than even last year, when the nurses invited a real magician to come to the ward on his birthday. The great Leonardo. He was the one who had taught Alex the fortune-telling trick that had gone so very wrong earlier today. After the excitement of the party, Alex's lungs had gone all spastic and he'd spiked a fever. Despite the 5 days in the ICU that followed, that was the best day of his life. Until tonight. Tonight he was going to have a real sleepover like a real kid with a real family. The girls brought popcorn and a movie, Star Wars, one of Alex's favorites, to keep him company until Grace and Vincent arrived. He watched the movie, hoping Grace would find a way to sneak Kat out of the tower as well. Then everything really would be perfect. The biggest mistake of my life, Renee Redding said as Eve closed the door to her office, ensuring their privacy, was leaving my son with his father. But the only reason Earl married me was to give his parents an heir, someone to carry on the Redding name. I thought he wanted Lucas so much that he would love him, take care of him. Eve watched as the meticulously groomed older woman sagged a bit with memory, and slid into the chair across from her desk. I was wrong, Renee admitted. She slanted her gaze up to meet Eve's, her back straight once more, knees together. I will not abandon my son again. Eve bought herself a moment by hanging up her lab coat, before taking her own chair behind the large, blonde oak desk. When she spoke, it was with her best clinical tone, the one designed to break bad news to family without them blaming the messenger. Mrs. Redding, I'm truly sorry that I haven't been able to help your son more than I have. But we knew from the beginning that this was a very difficult case, and that the chances of success were slim. Renee didn't react at all the way Eve expected. She was prepared for tearful arguing, a tirade decrying Eve's clinical skills, a protest of her son's innocence. But not for the shrewd narrowing of the older woman's eyes or the gleam of triumph reflected in them. You're not giving up on my son, Dr. Warden, Renee told her. No, not told, ordered. That's not you, the woman who dug herself out of a CoinJock, North Carolina trailer park and vowed never to return, leaving behind Daddy Dearest with the quick fists, and her mother the human punching bag. Not to mention the 4 younger brothers and sisters that you were expected to raise and shelter. Eve looked up, keeping her face placid as her nails bit into her palms out of sight beneath the desktop. You don't know anything about me. Renee rose to stand regal and tall over the desk. Surely you didn't think I'd entrust my son, much less something as important as the Lucidine project, to you without checking your background. Besides, your Tidewater twang comes out when you're upset or excited. You really should watch that, dear. Where I come from has nothing to do with the Lucidine project or your son. Maybe, maybe not. How about the fact that you stole the formula for Lucidine from your former lover during your neuro-anesthesia fellowship? Or the fact that that same lover shot himself with your gun after you left him in remorse, no doubt. Eve forced her anger down and lowered her eyes, blinking hard. Tom's death almost killed me. How dare you drag him into this? As she spoke, choking back imaginary tears, her hand inched over to the desk drawer containing her Smith & Wesson. 38. One thing about country girls, they learned early on the value of a good gun and knowing how to use it. Stop the theatrics. We are both women of the world here. You know as well as I that Tom Wilson didn't kill himself. That's all right. I've done as bad or worse myself. I admire you, Eve. We're a lot alike. And if you do what I say, we'll both get what we want, my son healthy, the Lucidine project up and running, and with both of those, we'll have control of every important piece of legislation coming out of Washington. Eve remained silent, uncertain if she should show her hand or bluff. The diamond-edged hardness in Renee's voice convinced her of the folly of further dissembling. Renee wanted to use Lucidine for her own ends, but if it also got Eve what she wanted. What did you have in mind? Renee pursed her lips into a satisfied smile. She edged her chair closer and sat back down. You originally said that if you had the Moran woman you could use her to convince Lucas that she really was dead, bring him closure, so that the new memories you gave him would overshadow his real ones. Yes. But that was before he suspected she was still alive. And I don't have Grace Moran, remember? Surely someone is looking for her. I mean, a crazy, sick, dying woman disappearing from the hospital. Eve nodded. Hellman told me he has Vincent Embark searching for her. The man you want to work with you on the Lucidine project. Perfect. He has as much to lose as we do. Not quite. He's not exactly on board with the project. Yet. Renee arched an eyebrow at that. He's a man, isn't he? However you do it, you need to get him working for us. Before it's too late. Even if Vincent finds her, we don't have much time, Eve argued. With Lucas building resistance to the idea that Moran is dead, it will take more intensive therapy to overcome that. I'll need to sedate him for a while before he'll be receptive enough that I can even start. It will work, Renee said with confidence. Especially if you can show him Moran's dead body. But you need to move fast. I can't stand to see Lucas in such turmoil. Her voice softened at the mention of her son, and Eve was surprised, again, by the intensity of the other woman's devotion to her warped and damaged child. Renee Redding truly did regret the choice she had made that left her son in the company of a sociopath like Earl Redding. She had devoted all her energy and considerable resources to giving Lucas every opportunity to live the life Earl had stolen from him. Even if that meant sacrificing Grace Moran's life to achieve that. Eve stared at the other woman long and hard, weighing the risks to herself and her project if she did as Renee suggested. Before she could say anything, there was a quick knock on the door and Vincent entered. "Hi," he said with a bright smile, as if he hadn't a care in the world. "Is this a bad time? I thought we could have dinner and talk more about your Lucidine clinic." His gaze caught Renee and he paused. "I'm sorry. I can come back." "Oh no," Renee said with a wide smile that revealed her gleaming white teeth. She stood and turned to Vincent, taking his hand and holding it for a moment too long. "Lucidine has saved my son," she gushed. "I wouldn't dream of keeping you two from your work." Eve stood as well, bristling as the older woman clung to Vincent's arm. "Laying it on too thick." But Vincent didn't seem to notice. Instead he beamed down at Renee. "Lucidine helped your son?" "Oh yes," Renee said. "Dr. Warden is a genius. The world will be a different place once more people have access to the Lucidine treatment program." She turned to Eve. "Thank you again, Dr. Warden. I don't know what we would have done without you. I'd best go. I know your time is precious." Then, with a knowing arch of an eyebrow at Eve, Renee left. Eve knew what she had to do. She glided from behind her desk to stand in front of Vincent, arching her back slightly and noting with satisfaction the way his gaze drifted to her breasts. "You look pleased with yourself," she said. "Did you find Grace Moran? I know where she'll be in the morning." She guided him to the seat Renee had just vacated and set herself to pouring coffee for him, her plan crystallizing. They'd have dinner and after, she'd dose his coffee with some Rohypnol. Just enough to make him complacent and to ensure amnesia if events took a turn the wrong way. She wasn't taking any chances, not with her dream so close. "That's great," she said, handing him his coffee, 2 creams, just the way he liked it. "If I start the brain mapping in the morning, it will give me just enough time to prepare her for surgery before it's too late." She stood beside him, watching as he sipped the French roast with satisfaction. "This isn't hospital issue. I spend so much time here that I like to treat myself with small indulgences. Good coffee, dinners catered by Julian's. In fact, I was just about to call in my order for tonight. Would you care to join me?" His eyes lit up and she knew she had him. She'd been watching Vincent for a while now, and knew that he enjoyed the finer things in life, including 4-star restaurants priced far beyond the budget of a resident. Which explained why he was sorely overextended and buried in debt. Once she hung up from ordering a sumptuous meal for the two of them, she regarded him. "I'm glad you met Renee," she said, moving to perch on the arm of his chair. "I was going to wait until it was certain, to surprise you." He glanced up at that. "Surprise me?" She bit her lip coyly and nodded. He shifted his weight, his arm brushing against her thigh. "Renee is one of the private investors in my Lucidine clinic. I told her about your interest in the program and mentioned how terrible it was, the way the Engagen's malpractice suit might prevent you from joining the staff here." "You told her about that?" His face colored, his brow creasing with a frown. "Not the details. She's a real advocate of tort reform, so she has an interest in frivolous malpractice cases. Anyway, she said that if you did decide to join the clinic staff, she would be willing to approach the Engagens with a settlement." He stared at her, disbelief widening his eyes. She heard his breath whistle through his pursed lips, then felt his body relax beside hers, as he realized the implications of her offer. Freedom. From a bleak future of bankruptcy, from the stain on his professional reputation. Why? He asked. The syllable emerged with a mixture of hope and skepticism. Why would a total stranger offer to spend that kind of money? Eve waved his doubts aside. Renee doesn't care about money. She has more than she knows what to do with. She cares about helping people. After seeing what Lucidine did for her son, she realizes that it has the potential to change the world, to change the future of medicine. She traced her fingers along Vincent's strong jawline, tilting his face up so that he stared into hers. She's a dreamer. Like us, Vincent. He held her gaze for a long moment. Eve was certain she'd won. Who would have believed it would be so easy? But then he shook himself, pulling away from her, and stood. She watched as he strode across the room from her to the bookcase housing the video screens. His shoulders hunched as he watched the flickering black and white images being recorded. She gave him a moment before joining him. You've seen for yourself how powerful Lucidine can be, she reminded him. Look. There's Angie. Severe bulimia, depression, self-mutilation, suicidal when she arrived 3 weeks ago. She pointed to the teenager, still too thin, but perched in a comfortable chair, reading a book as she snacked on cheese and crackers, her face serene. When she first got here, the only nutrition she got was forced down her through a nasogastric tube that she pulled out every time she was released from her restraints. As if Angie knew they were talking about her, she turned the page in her book and laughed, then reached for another piece of cheese. Look at her, Vincent, Eve urged. She's happy now. She's cured. Free to live her life again, because of Lucidine. He remained silent, glancing at the other active monitor. Charles and Randy playing pool in the group room, their expressions bright and animated. Eve knew they would retire to Randy's room later, where Charles would inject her with enough insulin to render her numb, without feeling, as he had his way with her. No need for Vincent to know what went on behind the scenes, or that she was using Randy's need to avoid feeling anything, even pleasure, to guide Charles away from his sadistic fantasies. Not that either Randy or Charles, both consenting adults, were complaining. But Vincent might not understand. Not yet, anyway. Tell me about Renee's son, he said, turning to face her again. Eve was glad that when Renee arrived she had turned off the monitor feed from Luca's room. If she would have Grace here in the morning, she needed to sedate Lucas tonight, prepare him for the intensive therapy once Vincent left. That was a tough case, she admitted, leaning back against her desk. I almost lost him. The psychiatrists had him so drugged up that the poor guy didn't know what was reality, and what existed only in his twisted fantasies. Had no idea what was right or wrong, he was so confused and delusional. You see, she gave him the same story that the rest of the staff had heard. His wife had died under tragic circumstances and Lucas, he couldn't cope with it. His grief literally drove him mad, to the point where he insisted that she was still alive. It got so bad the psychiatrists declared him a danger to both himself and the women he began to stalk, desperate to find his wife again. They had him committed, pumped up with drugs until he didn't know his own name by the time his mother's lawyers were able to get him released to my care. He frowned at that. And now? It's been a long haul, but he's almost cured. In fact, he's so improved that he's back working as a consultant, doing market research again. She omitted the fact that he was telecommuting from a padded room. His eyes narrowed in appraisal. A knock on the door announced the arrival of their dinner. Can I think about it? Of course, she lied. Poor man, after she finished with him tonight he'd be ready to commit to anything. She'd love to take her time, waltz and seduce him in a way that would give her as much pleasure and enjoyment as him, but time was too short. Ah well, couldn't be helped. Take all the time you need. Chapter 21 Razor's Edge. Grace rolled over on her side, the plastic-covered mattress crinkling under her weight. The burnt smelt of hospital linens was suddenly replaced with Old Spice and ivory soap. She squeezed her eyes shut. Go to sleep, she commanded herself. Just ignore it and go to sleep. This was all a crazy dream. A hallucination brought forth by a broken mind. Either that or she was already dead, lying in the rain on the helipad in the dark, crows squawking as they descended to pick at her remains. Her body shuddered at the thought and she almost opened her eyes to decide once and for all which was the truth, death or insanity. But then his hand slid over her shoulders, lifting her hair, cascading it through his fingers to rain back down on her. You've let your hair grow, Jimmy whispered, his breath stirring the fine hairs of her cheek. I like it. She cursed her body as it responded to his touch, relaxing as his arm curled around her chest, his fingers playfully stroking hers. If she was dead, a murder of crows currently feasting on her body cooling on the rooftop, then how could he make her feel like this? Unless, somehow, this was real. No. It couldn't be. That would be worse than being dead. Because if Jimmy was here with her now, and she was still alive, then that meant. I'm here, everything's all right now, he assured her. She sucked in her breath even as he rolled her over to face him. Don't look, became her mantra. For 4 years she'd sold her soul in an effort to resurrect the dead. All that time it was as simple as a brain tumor invading key areas, eroding her mind, stealing her senses. She'd straddled the knife edge of reason for so long, occasionally tempted to topple over into insanity, that now she clung to the knowledge that she wasn't crazy, that there was a reason for this hallucination. Please, Lord, she prayed, really prayed, for the first time in years. But that was how desperate she had become. Death or insanity was preferable to the possibility that what had happened on the helipad, in the corridor, was real. No. Please, let it be just a dream. Because I can't bear to lose him again. His lips moved over hers and she tasted barley, and hops of Guinness, and the salt of bar nuts. Hands that knew her better than she knew herself caressed her. Please, Grace, he begged. Look at me. She was drowning in the smell of ivory soap and Old Spice. Still her eyes remained clenched shut, even as she clung to him, not wanting to release him. Ever? It had almost killed her to lose him once. How could she risk it again? He brushed his lips against both her eyelids, his light caress tempting, oh so tempting. Our love lives forever, he whispered. Did you doubt me? Think that I wouldn't find a way? TSK, Grace. Anything is possible. You should have had more faith than that. Faith? He thought she lacked faith. What did he think had kept her alive the past 4 years? Unable to bear it any longer, she opened her eyes and faced Jimmy's too solid countenance. You bastard. The sound of her slap echoed through the small room. His flesh was warm, her hand left a pink imprint on his cheek. Grace blinked, then fell against him, her fists pummeling his bare chest, as she collapsed under the weight of her anguish. How could you leave me? You left me. I was alone. Alone. Her sobs choked the words so that they emerged in short, breathless cries of desperation. And now you're going to leave again, aren't you? Aren't you? The word emerged from him in a mournful sigh. We have until tomorrow, sundown. He held her close, saying nothing until her fury and grief were spent. He rocked her against his chest like a child, humming nonsense syllables as he laid his face against her hair. His heartbeat echoed from his body into hers, each beat mocking her with its vitality. Why, Jimmy? Why did you come to torture me like this? I came to help you, love. I would never hurt you. You know that. Grace, tell me you know that. Please tell me that. He raised her face to his eyes searching hers. Tears caressed his cheeks. Grace traced her finger through his tears. Her breathing slowed and she regained control. She knew now what she had to do. You have until sundown. Yes. A day, no more, no less. When you leave, I'm going with you. Ah, love, I wish you could. You have to wait your time. Then we can be together again. She shook her head, watched as his eyes clouded. No more waiting, Jimmy. When you leave, I'm going as well. One way or the other. No, no, you can't. He reached a hand to tangle in her hair, tilting her chin up as his forehead creased in a frown. Please, no, Grace. That's why I came back. To stop you. If you kill yourself, we can never be together. But we could have been together if I made it out of here and went home to die, right? He nodded, his frown deepening. Then why wasn't I able to do that? Why can't I choose how I want to live or die? There are things I know but I don't understand, Grace, he said slowly as if searching for the right words and finding none. Faith is necessary. Faith? How dare you talk to me about faith? You of all people, you hypocritical bastard. How dare God or whoever the hell is making these rules play with my life? She glared at him, remembering the convenient timing of the lightning strikes that yesterday had driven her back inside the hospital, blocking her escape to the warm comfort of her home. Did you do it, Jimmy? Did you stop me yesterday? You or whoever is pulling your strings. Why? It's my life, damn it. Thunder outside the windows punctuated her words, the force rattling the glass, but she paid it no heed. God or whoever, whatever obviously wanted her alive, so what was she going to do? Strike her dead? Sending Jimmy back to her, and then telling her he'd be yanked away again, was already worse than any torture she could imagine. Jimmy, she said, sliding away from his arms, dodging his warm caress, tell me why you're really here. Because this sure as hell isn't an answer to my prayers. Christ, you're a stubborn woman. Are you trying to say that you never prayed to have me back again? It's not the having you here that I've a problem with, and you damn well know it. It's the thought of losing you again. She drew in a ragged breath, hands fisted at her sides. It'll kill me, Jimmy. You know it will. No? No, it won't. The woman I knew, the woman I fell in love with, is stronger than that. He laid his hands on her shoulders, lowered his forehead to touch hers. She closed her eyes, shaking her head. Maybe once. But not anymore. I'm tired, Jimmy. So tired. I just want to go home, lie in our bed, pull the covers over my head and what? Die? Why the hell not? If it's my time, right? What's to stop my walking out that door and just keep on going? I am. You are. So you broke every law of physics, of science, of heaven and earth to come here and hold me prisoner. Why are you really here, Jimmy? And what's it to do with me? If you leave, Alex will get that transplant. He'll suffer in agony for 8 months before succumbing to pneumonia and finally dying. Alone. Grace turned her head, stepped away from him. I'm sorry, but there's no guarantee the ethics committee will listen to me anyway. Without you, Kat might not go through with her surgery. Without it, she'll die. Liar. I already talked to Kat. She's pissed as hell, but she's going to have the surgery. Even if it's only to spite me. She narrowed her eyes and stared down at him. You didn't know that, did you? Why not? Doesn't your boss, Mr. All-seeing, all-knowing, fill you in on details? He frowned again, swung his legs around and sat up. I could hear your thoughts before except when you were over there. He jerked his head in the direction of the tower. I have no power there. You hear my thoughts? Then you must be getting an earful right now, oh husband of mine. I can't hear them anymore, Grace, not since he gestured to his naked body. Then he sighed and slumped back onto the bed. Why are we wasting precious time arguing? I'm here, really here, and I love you, Grace, more than ever. Why can't you let me show you how much? Why can't you believe in me, trust me? Low blow, Jimmy. Besides, how the hell am I to trust you when you're using me and you won't tell me why? I can't. You can cross the great divide, but you can't tell me what you want me to do or why. Free will, the choice must be yours in the end, Grace. I made my choice. I want to go home to die. His sigh whispered through the room like footsteps through a graveyard, chilling her very marrow. He stood and walked toward her, eyes locked onto hers. She tilted her head, certain he was going to try to change her mind with more of his seductive caresses. Instead, he stepped past her and opened the door. He stood in the threshold. Palms up, arms wide open. Then go. I won't stop you. But if you do, we'll never see each other again. In this life or the next. The hope of seeing him, somehow being with him in some form in the hereafter, had been Grace's only religion for a long time. That desperate, ragged, frayed strand of hope was her lifeline. She had clung to it during 4 long years of endless tortured nights. She was a scientist trained to question everything, to take nothing on faith, but that one irrational belief had sustained her where science and medicine had failed so miserably. Now she finally had reason to believe that her faith had not been misplaced, proof of a world beyond scientific measurement or calculation, proof that she hadn't suffered 4 years in hell for nothing. And he was forcing her to choose between the pain of losing him forever and the torture of returning to the purgatory her life had become. Her tears flowed silently, blurring her vision as she stared at him. Why? Just help me understand why you're doing this to me, Jimmy. He wept as well and finally stepped forward, wrapping those strong, warm arms of his around her, pulling her close. So many questions, he said, always so many questions. He pulled her down onto the bed and held her, rocking her like a child until her breathing and his synchronized and their hearts beat as one. Then his breathing became deep and regular, a metronome that resonated within Grace's memory. Who knew ghosts snored? Grace lay still, fighting her own exhaustion. She was a scientist, or she once had been one. How could she allow her imagination to run away like this, tumor or no tumor? Still, it had felt so real. She glanced over at Jimmy's sleeping form. No, she already knew she couldn't trust the evidence of her eyes. She looked down at her fingernails, remembering the way she had desperately clung to him, scratching at his back. And found nothing. Her nails were cut very short, too short to have gathered evidence of human contact, much less a ghost. The thought finally crushed her. Grace folded her legs into her chest, hugging them, her only grip on reality. Why was she struggling so hard to prove her sanity? Who was she fooling, anyway? Then another thought raced through her mind, one that rocked her to the core. Maybe the tumor wasn't heaven sent after all. What good could come of tormenting her this way? Tears and laughter both choked her throat, fighting for control. Hysteria won. Because tangled between her wedding band and engagement ring was a strand of gold-red hair. Solid, real, tangible proof. Grace Marie D'Angelo Moran, former medical doctor, recent agoraphobic, current brain tumor patient, apparently had indeed conjured herself a ghost. Chapter 22 Comfort Measures. Eve cracked open the door to Vincent's call room and looked in. She smiled, remembering her own nights spent in similar rooms, glad that period in her life was over. Now if she stayed late at work it was because she wanted to, not because she was at the beck and call of others. Like most residents, Vincent had left the bathroom light on and the door cracked open, the better to read messages on his pager without the shock of turning on the overhead light. He stirred, the mattress squeaking as he turned in his sleep and began to snore. How adorable. Just like a baby who was about to have a very pleasant dream. She slipped into the room, closing the door behind her. Stripping out of her blouse and skirt, she moved over to the bedside table and carefully opened the tiny vial of chloroform. Old-fashioned, but suitable for her purposes. Guaranteed to both sedate and arouse, the anesthetic had once been used as an aphrodisiac. Combined with the small dose of rohypnol she had slipped him earlier, he would be easily swayed by any suggestion, physical or otherwise, that she made. Eve held a surgical mask. The chemical would burn if it touched bare flesh, and carefully placed a few drops on it. The cloyingly sweet scent of ether wafted through the room, as she held the mask beneath Vincent's nose. She breathed shallowly, but still caught enough of the chemical to give her a delicious tingling that began at her toes and worked up her body. Vincent coughed once, but then remained still as Eve climbed into the bed with him. She placed the mask within reach on the nightstand just in case. Usually one dose was enough. Once begun, she could allow nature to take its course. Often she could even convince the man that he had seduced her by the time it was all over. But it was really Eve in control, and that was the most powerful aphrodisiac of all. Vincent was drowning in flowers. He choked down the sweet scent, half arousing from his sleep. There was a weight on him. A woman, he realized as her hands slid up his naked chest. Naked. The thought nearly pierced the veil of confusion that had engulfed him. He was on call, wasn't he? He never slept nude in the hospital. Then her lips covered his and he was drowning again, but this time the sensation was welcome, drifting in a field of flowers, all responsibilities, and worries left far behind. The taste of sweet vanilla on a tongue that twisted with his. If this was a dream, it was the best one he'd had in a long time. The lips left his, proceeding on a taste tour of his neck, his shoulder. "Grace," he whispered. She froze, and for 1 second he was certain that he'd broken the spell. His thoughts seemed joined to his body by tenuous cobwebs, but he dimly realized that she was taller, more curved, fuller-figured than Grace's lean boniness. He started to pull back, to try to look upon the woman before him, but she held him tight against her body. A raucous beeping clamored through his brain, igniting a throbbing headache. The noise meant something important. It was soon joined by another, their high-pitched tones a jarring counterpoint to the groaning of the bed and the guttural moans escaping Vincent's mouth as waves of pleasure rocked him. Her hand left his flesh for an aching moment, followed by the clatter of 2 pagas banished to the ground, devoured by hobgoblins and hordes of dust bunnies hidden beneath the bed. Her fingers returned, raking at the flesh of his back, sending delicious shockwaves of pain and pleasure through him. He heard Grace's voice coming from a distance and knew it was vital that he listen, attend to her words, but by the time they reached his brain they were consumed by his passion, burnt to meaningless fragments. It was as if he could no longer speak or understand English. The only language he knew was the primordial urge that had overtaken his body and mind. Her head rolled forward, her teeth sinking into the flesh of his shoulder. Pain shot through him as she bit deep enough to draw blood, her talons tearing at the flesh around his spine. Vincent jerked up in pain, opening his eyes in the dim light. It took a few moments, but finally his vision began to clear. His eyes met the monochromic grey of Eve Warden's. She smiled at him, gleaming white teeth in a wide mouth. Vincent blinked hard. There was a tiny drop of blood sliding along the edge of one perfectly formed incisor. Her tongue ran across her teeth and it vanished. His head was pounding, keeping time from the insistent beeping echoing beneath the bed. He was on call. What the hell had happened? Fog swirled through his mind, impenetrable and leaving him with a cold chill in the pit of his gut. A woman's voice called to him, but Eve's lips never moved. "Grace?" Then he realized it wasn't Grace's voice, but the hospital operator's sounding outside in the hallway. Announcing a code: a patient in distress. Room 703. Eve gave him a sideways smile, appearing coy and much younger than her years. "I still can't believe you talked me into coming here. I've never." He brought her here. Vincent searched his memory, but it was shrouded in confusion. He slumped back, exhausted, devoured, empty, devastated. Ravished. The best sex he'd ever had, and he could barely remember it. At least she seemed satisfied as she curled up on top of his chest, her tongue teasing his neck like a cat licking cream from its whiskers. How had he ever convinced Eve to join him in bed while he was on call? He was on call. He jolted upright, reaching for his scrubs, trying to pull himself together, as the operator's urgent message penetrated his fuzzy and cobweb-cloaked brain. "There's a code," he told Eve, his tongue thick as he struggled to form the words. She rolled off of him, and he couldn't help watching as she moved with a dancer's grace, sliding her clothes back on. "Room 703, she said, her voice cutting through the haze as she bent down to retrieve her pager. "That's Catherine Jellicle's room." As she walked out, Vincent groaned in dismay, struggling into his clothes, pulling his shoes on even as he tore out of the room. He'd messed up, big time, the words chased him. All because he'd been thinking with his glands instead of his brain. Cat might die. Might be dead already. Chapter 23 Twist of Fate. Jimmy kissed Grace's forehead and crept from the room. He hated leaving her, hoped she wouldn't awaken, that she might not even know that he was gone, but he needed answers. He gathered some discarded clothing from a locker, fumbling with the scrubs and lab coat until fingers remembered the once familiar routine of tying and buttoning. A pair of green clogs, still wrapped in surgical booties speckled with old blood, provided protection for his feet. Now properly disguised and attired, he returned to the helipad. "Bravo, bravo. Well done, Jimmy." Brother Leo stood on the parapet that guarded the empty space between the annex roof and the skyway. He clapped his hands and with a whoosh of what sounded like wings, leapt down to land in front of Jimmy. No easy feat given that the door where Jimmy stood was a good 15 feet from the parapet. "I'm proud of you, me boy," he continued in a fake brogue that made Jimmy gag. All the more so because he knew that this man, of all men, could assume the genuine thing any time he desired. He meant to mock Jimmy, go at him. The Jesuit seemed incapable of standing still, pacing the roof in long strides. He appeared as an ordinary man, wore faded black jeans, a dark cotton shirt, black leather loafers. Ordinary until you gazed into his eyes, dark pools of night that seemed to have no bottom, that threatened to swallow you whole if you dared stare too long. "Many before you have begun this journey," Leo said. "But you're one of the few who has actually made it this far." He nodded his head at Jimmy's very solid form. "Unfortunately their track record has been, shall we say, mixed at best. It's overwhelming for most, the temptations of the flesh, the intoxifying scent of life. Sure you're up to it. Hate to see you lose everything and in doing so, condemn Grace as well." Jimmy straightened, tried to pin him to one spot with a glare. "I need to know everything. Why I'm here, what I'm to do, what Grace needs. I need answers. Now?" The priest's chuckle rang merrily through the night, echoing from the glass panes of the skyway, battering at Jimmy from all sides. "My dear boy, you know me better than that. I'm not in the business of giving anyone answers, merely teaching you how to find the right questions to ask. I've done what you asked. I kept her here. Now tell me why. Your job is only half done. You need to stop her from going into the darkness." Leo stopped his frenetic pacing and spun to stare at the tower standing beyond the void crossed by the skyway. "And help her make the right choice even if it means giving her up." Jimmy didn't like the sound of that. He'd come too damn far to give Grace up ever again. "I'm human now. At least for a day. Tell me what needs to be done. I'll do it. Leave Grace out of it, she's suffered enough." Brother Leo was silent for a moment, his attention consumed by the tower. He shook himself then turned back to Jimmy. "No can do. There are rules, you know." "Rules? But can't you talk to him, them who? God the Almighty, Shiva, Buddha, creator of heaven and earth, take your pick. There are many names, an infinite number of faces, and they are all wrong. Nothing is all-powerful. There are merely powers. Some strive to maintain balance, some feed off chaos. You mean angels and demons? And which are you? For a self-proclaimed agnostic, you sure take these labels seriously. Me? Call me an independent contractor. What the hell does that mean? It means I have a goal, a destiny to fulfill. I'm not content to merely inspire and watch from the sidelines, but I've not succumbed to the temptation to join the frenzy either. It means that I'm a lot like you, my boy. I also have someone to save. Jimmy's teeth ground together, as his fists clenched tight. It took all his willpower not to strike out against the man more than man before him. He was getting damn tired of this nonsense. All he knew was that he wanted, he had to protect Grace. Even if it meant sacrificing himself. Hell, he'd already died once and lived to tell the tale. If you're not a god or even an angel, then what's to stop me from wringing your scrawny neck? More laughter. Nothing, of course. That's the beauty of it all. Free will. Everything hinges on it, darkness and light, order and chaos, the past and the future. If only I'd known that when I was a man. We wouldn't have been having this conversation, none of this would have been necessary. He trailed off, staring over the abyss separating the annex from the tower, as if he'd surprised himself with his revelation. If only, but what's done is done. All I can do now is remove the temptation, eliminate the need to make the choice. Temptation? You mean like God and the devil playing with Adam and Eve and Job and such? Leo slowly nodded and turned back to Jimmy. Jimmy had the feeling Leo was finishing a conversation with himself, and had only just remembered Jimmy was there. I didn't say that there is a God. A scholar such as yourself should know better than to jump to conclusions. You're really starting to piss me off. Maybe I'll just take a stroll over there, he nodded to the skyway and the tower beyond, and see what they have to offer. Maybe they'll give me answers, help me save Grace. Others before you have made that choice. You know your Milton, don't you? Jimmy frowned. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. Are you saying that's the devil over there, that you're sending Grace up against Lucifer? Like hell you are, not if I've a breath left in my body to stop you. Brother Leo swiveled his head, his mane of silver hair shimmering in the dim moonlight, and stared at Jimmy. I do believe you're serious. He chuckled once more. In all the millennia I've traveled to, that's the one thing that never changes. Humans, so unpredictable yet always so dreadfully serious, certain that you're the center of the universe. Of course, he continued, talking to himself, in this instance you are. My, oh my. He rubbed his hands together, as if anticipating some enjoyment. This time, it just might work. I've had enough of your bullshit, Jimmy said, turning on his heel and stalking back to the door. Wait, you've missed my point. Jimmy stopped, looked over his shoulder at the Jesuit. Which is? That Milton had it wrong. To reign in hell implies that both there is such a place, and that it is ruled by a sense of order. Neither is true. If you cross the skyway, leave my sphere of influence to enter the darkness, that's exactly what you'll find. Darkness, nothingness, the ultimate void. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, that's the closest thing to the truth of hell. Chaos, disintegration, you'd be rendered into atoms, your atoms shredded into flotsam of even smaller particles, all cast randomly to all corners of the universe. That's what we are fighting against. Nothing. We are fighting nothing. The ultimate force of destruction, the darkness that swallows all light, the force that someday will destroy the universe. Chaos, entropy, anarchy. Call it what you will, it's a fight that began with the dawn of time, and that we are doomed to lose. Brother Leo's face grew clouded, then suddenly brightened as he grinned, revealing gleaming white, perfect teeth. But not today. And not tomorrow. We are mere foot soldiers, my boy, fighting small skirmishes. Every battle is important in a war that encompasses eternity. And this battle has special significance to me. We need to stop a future, and we don't have much time. Jimmy felt his head begin to pound as he struggled to follow the Jesuit's reasoning. Stop the future. Stop a future, Leo corrected. One man's future. And your grace is the key. She can save the world. Jimmy turned his gaze upon the tower. Something about the modern edifice of steel and glass felt wrong, as if it were off-center, skewed just enough to make Jimmy's head spin, and his stomach roil with nausea. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath. Why do you believe I sent you back to her, Jimmy? Brother Leo said. Jimmy opened his eyes, focused on the Jesuit instead of the tower swimming in his peripheral vision. To help her. To keep her from killing herself, losing her soul by committing a mortal sin. Brother Leo tilted his head and arched an eyebrow. This isn't catechism. You don't have to tell me what you think I want to hear. To help her is why I told you I sent you. Now tell me why you think I sent you. Jimmy blew his breath out in frustration. Nothing like a duel of wits with a representative of the Almighty himself to make a man realize how small he was in the grand scheme of things. Because something's coming, something big and bad. So awful that the life of one puny mortal woman doesn't matter in comparison. He didn't bother to hide the bitter impotency he felt. And you'd be right on both counts. So you're just using her and me, is that it? That's what all your fine preaching and proselytizing and philosophizing come down to. If you're human, and you've the misfortune to be in a time and place where God, or whatever the hell you call him, can use you, then you're screwed. He practically spat the words out. Screw you and the whole damn universe. You can just go bugger yourself. Brother Leo's laughter cleaved the night, accompanied by a howl of wind and bolt of lightning. Joan d'Arc said the same thing to me as I led her to the stake and lit the fire. It sounded a lot nicer in French. Bloody hell. What's the use? Jimmy said, smacking one useless fist into his other palm. What the hell was the good of being human again, if he was helpless to save Grace? I like you, Jimmy, I really do. And Grace, too. Do you remember what I told you and Grace on the day I married you? The words sang through Jimmy's mind with crystal clarity, but he resisted. If I'd known who you were then, I would have eloped, taken Grace, and skived off to Tahiti. I'm sure you would have. Free will, remember? Jimmy paused, staring past Leo into the abyss that the glass skyway crossed. If Leo would just shut up for a minute, maybe this buzz of confusion in his brain would stop. You sent Grace to Maeve's tomb. You planned for us to meet, to fall in love. He went rigid, took a step towards the priest. Did you plan what happened next? Did you know what Lucas Redding was going to do to her? His hands were reaching for the older man's throat before he could blink twice. Leo put up no resistance, merely arched an eyebrow, as if disappointed in Jimmy. Sparks of blue-white energy crackled between the Jesuit's flesh and Jimmy's palms, igniting a blaze of pain that forced Jimmy back. I'm the one who tried to stop you from returning home, Leo said, his voice infuriatingly calm. Remember? Just as I tried for years to dissuade Grace from medicine or from practicing here. I tried so hard to prevent her path from crossing Lucas Redding's. He shrugged. Free will. Jimmy lowered his hands, opening and closing his fists in frustration. Why do you think I led you to Maeve's treasure? Leo asked. I gave the two of you a chance to save the world. Jimmy rubbed his finger along his forehead, trying to quiet the insistent hum setting his teeth on edge. It was as if he'd gotten too close to a high-voltage wire. As if Leo were a being of pure energy, yet he was also solid. He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. But you still let us come back here. Even knowing free will. Jimmy was beginning to hate those two words. But finally Leo's voice held a hint of regret. I did everything in my power to prevent Grace and Lucas from meeting, than to keep the pair of you safe. Why do you think I traveled thousands of years through time? I knew this day was coming. I don't understand. Lucas already, he faltered. He's already done what's done. How are you going to change it now? I can't. But with your help, grace can prevent a greater evil. Leo nodded to the tower looming over them, casting its shadow on them. Finally, this time, I can stop it. Jimmy frowned, still confused. And irritated because he knew that Leo meant him to be. Somehow this new evil, here in the present, has its roots back 3,000 years ago with Maeve. I saved the Callistians so that Maeve could use their treasure to save her people. She did. No. She saved a few. Saved one wretched island. If she'd listened to me, she could have raised an army, swept through a continent. Then there would have been no Roman Empire, all of Europe would have been under Celtic rule. And with no Romans, 1,000 years later there would have been no crucifixion. You're mad. Insane. What could be so evil that you try to alter the entire history of civilization to stop it? Just a man. One weak, simple man. He's alive right now, on his way here. Leo's laugh was bitter. But we can still stop him. You've said yourself that Christianity has led to the deaths of more people than any other force in human history. So who's to call it civilization? If Maeve had heeded me instead of tending to her own tattered flock, who knows how the world would have changed? Not you. Yet you were willing to take the gamble with all of history to pay if you were wrong. Leo's grin was ghastly white in the darkness. Yes, I was. Does that frighten you? It should. How can you masquerade as a man of God? It's easy once you realize there is no God. What do you say, Jimmy? Want to join me in changing the future? Jimmy looked up at that. Me? Can I do this for Grace? Save her the pain? I wish I knew. I'm not even sure if you'll have the chance to help her. The choice is solely up to her. Back to that free will crap again. What the bloody hell good is all this power you speak of if it all boils down to one poor, sick, tired woman's choice? How can you put that on her? It's not fair, damn it. Fair's not a part of the bargain. But free will without that, the entire enterprise would spin off into oblivion like a snake eating its own tail. I don't understand. You're not meant to. Does she love you, Jimmy? Jimmy looked up at that, effortlessly met Leo's dark, penetrating gaze. You know she does. So she has courage. Has she the strength to hope? Jimmy hesitated, thinking of Grace's words to him earlier. That's the only thing that's kept her alive these past 4 years. And do you love her enough to let her go? To allow her to live, to love again with another man? Wicked fingers of fear reached in and chilled Jimmy's gut. The stars overhead seemed to grow distant and dim, and he thought for a moment he might fall back into the void he'd been released from. He thought of Grace, of her pain, of how it had almost devoured her. He nodded to the priest, swallowed hard and found his voice. Yes. If it means her life, yes, I could. Leo's smile was as wide as a Cheshire cat's. Good. Then maybe there's a chance. For both of you. The howl of a madman ripped through the night, mocking his words. Lights began to flash in the tower, silhouetting Leo in a blaze of color. Jimmy looked past Leo to the tower and the chaos storming the halls of the ECU. A shudder raced through him and he crossed his arms, straining to get warm. So it's begun, Brother Leo said in a terrifyingly calm voice. You'd best get to work, Jimmy. Time's a-wasting. All I have to do is keep Grace from crossing over to the tower. Jimmy considered that. Given the pleasant way his first few hours back on Earth had passed, that shouldn't be too difficult. Then he spotted movement on the skyway. He whirled as a woman's figure ran past, a dark silhouette viewed through the glass that was so close yet a lifetime away. Jimmy bolted to the parapet, shouting her name, waving his arms in a vain attempt to get her attention, to stop her. Grace? No. He teetered on the edge of the low wall, precariously close to falling into the dark chasm separating the skyway from the helipad. Brother Leo's strong fingers dug into his arm, hauling him back to safety. Watch your step there, boyo. Jimmy spun around to face the priest. What the hell are we meant to do now? We have to stop her, you have to get her back. The fates have spoken, Brother Leo said with a grim smile, and a one-shouldered shrug that made Jimmy want to slap some sense into him. Like hell they have. I'm not losing her, not again. Leo clucked his tongue in reprimand. Free will. She was never yours to begin with. Never lose sight of that, old man. Jimmy advanced on the monk, fists raised, ready to do some serious damage. Leo raised a hand and Jimmy found himself frozen in place, unable to even breathe. His heart, that wonderful machine whose thumping had so entranced him since his return, he felt it stutter, then lurch to a stop. He was dead, or hovering on the brink of death. Held back only by Leo's power. If you hurry, you might still be able to save the boy. And through him, find a second chance to save Grace. You must keep her with the boy. For a brief moment Jimmy's vision reddened with fury. Abused he was a pawn in a game that he did not understand. Powerless. His chest began to constrict as the need for oxygen became urgent. Leo waved his hand once more and Jimmy stumbled forward, gasping for air, his heart pounding. The best you can do for Grace is to save the boy, Leo repeated. The door to the annex flew open, as a gust of wind whipped around the Jesuit, blurring his form and blinding Jimmy's vision. Jimmy blinked and he was alone on the rooftop. He stared for a long moment at the now brightly lit tower. Shadowy figures were silhouetted, racing along the ECU's corridors in a frenzy. One of them was Grace, he was certain. He squeezed his eyes shut, praying as he had never prayed before in this life, or the one previous. Please God, if there is a God, protect and keep her safe. Please. He turned and ran through the annex door, pounding down the steps to the pediatric unit. If you think this video's ending left you hanging, just wait until you see what happens next. Subscribe to our channel to make sure you don't doze off before the next big plot twist.